Good afternoon to all of you here on the East Coast, and for those of you tuning in elsewhere. It's good to have you with us. It is January 9th. I'm speaking with you from Midtown Manhattan, and it is the first time that we are broadcasting to you in 2024. So even though we're a few days into the month, let me wish all of you a very happy new year. It's great to be back with you, and we're hopeful that you had a restful period, a restorative period. And as we dive into what's ahead in 2024, we wanted to bring you, much as we did last year, a year ago, a set of elements on the program today that are about looking ahead, that are about trying to give you our best sense in terms of what's in store for 2024. So with that in mind, let me turn to the agenda. And Kathy, thank you for advancing the slides, please. We're going to have a few different speakers with us from literally across the country with various bond offices engaged. I will be with you for just another moment or two. And then Roger Bearden, who has been on the program a number of times previously out of our Albany office, who's an attorney with deep experience in government and in healthcare, will be looking ahead at the legislative and regulatory picture with particular focus on New York State. It's timely. Today is Governor Kathy Hochul's State of the State address. And so there's a lot that is churning in a good way in that space, and we'll do our best to read the tea leaves. And then after that, Seth Gilbertson out of our Buffalo office will be taking a similar, at least analogous look at what's in store with higher education over the course of 2024. Seth, of course, is a regular on this broadcast, and Seth, we're very glad to have you back. Kyle Skillman is with us from Kansas. As many of you are aware, we have a practice focusing on collegiate sports law, and Kyle is an important member of that practice, and he'll be looking at what it is that's important in that area of law, one that touches on many of you, and for those of you who are less familiar, we hope it's an opportunity to learn a little bit more about how that practice fits in with those others across our firm. Then later, you'll be hearing from Delaney Knapp and Tom Clifford. Delaney and Tom together, two associates, each steeped in the work of our exempt organizations practice, will be addressing the Corporate Transparency Act, not so much the act itself, which is a big headline that we'll be coming back to over the course of the programming in 24, but what is really important for exempt organizations to be worrying about, and where there may be some space and exceptions, as it were, for those organizations. So that'll be something to look toward the end of the program for. And then I'll be throughout taking your questions and doing my best to make sure that if things come up from the audience, that we're addressing them over the course of the broadcast. But for now, let me do my best to turn it over to the others who will be presenting throughout this afternoon's broadcast, if you're here on the East Coast. Roger Bearden, as I mentioned, is with us from Albany. He has spent a significant chapter of his career in government, both within the executive chamber and in agency leadership roles, among other positions. And so he's very well equipped to give us a walkthrough of what has happened in terms of legislative highlights since we last were with you at the end of 2023, but really more so focusing on, so what do we know and what do we think is coming? And we'll do the same with touch points in the regulatory space. So Roger, glad to have you back with us, and please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gabe. And it is an exciting time for those of us in Albany, since it's both the State of the State this week, this afternoon, starting at 1 o'clock, and then next week would be the release of the governor's budget, which contains both fiscal ideas as well as often a fair number of policy proposals. So if we could go to the next slide. So just a brief detour into the political calendar. and there's a permeability here between what's happening in the state and what's happening federally. There are a couple of special elections that are coming up, one most immediately in Long Island, and then after that in Buffalo near the end of the year. The Court of Appeals directed congressional redistricting, and that's an again. So that's going to be happening. And one of the bills that was signed into law near the end of last year was a bill aligning most local elections onto an even year cycle. So that's something that certainly is going to not happen for another year or so, but it's something that's already causing a realignment as people see their terms and see how that might fit within their own political futures. And obviously, this is a fall election season for both president and for the legislature, not for the governor. So those are all going to be impacting sort of the Albany scene in this year. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, Governor's State of the State is this afternoon. There's already been some previews. There's now a fifth item because that was announced yesterday and these slides were completed the day before. The governor has been releasing various planks to the State of the State, one having to do with consumer protection, a second having to do with increasing reading proficiency, a third having to do with maternal and infant mortality, a fourth having to do with swimming and encouragement of that in the state. The fifth, which has to do with artificial intelligence, was an announcement around a consortium of universities that are coming together to try to stimulate the artificial intelligence industry in New York State, as well as the announcement of a policy framework from the state ITS, which is the Information Technology Services Agency, that seeks to include certain protections. I certainly think all of those will be featured both in the speech this afternoon as well as in the budget release, which happens on or before Tuesday the 16th, so that's next week. Usually it happens on that day, and that's when those of us who are following this thing look closely to see what is in fact being proposed, what is the language, what are the investments that are being proposed. Next slide, please. So this slide gets a 2024 key issues and gets a question mark because, like all predictions of the future, that some unreliability. Certainly housing was a major theme last year with the proposal to expand housing density in near suburbs near New York City. That obviously did not progress, and it's not clear at this moment to what degree that's going to be advanced either by the governor or by the houses. Migrants, so there's been obviously a significant issue, particularly downstate, with accommodating migrants who come to New York. That intersects with the housing issues and fiscal issues that are likely to be predominant in the discussions. Mental health, major theme last year, continues to be something that's talked a lot about. Education, always a perennial, whether it's a fiscal or a policy. Certainly on the policy side, we already have a preview of some focus on reading instruction. Healthcare workforce, there's a number of healthcare issues that are percolating, particularly throughout various healthcare systems, the unavailability of the workforce, and then artificial intelligence. Made a prediction a few days ago that would be a major theme, and it appears to be already bearing fruit. But what exactly is going to be involved and what's going to be proposed is yet to be known. Next slide, please. So, question of what defines productivity in a legislative session, just giving some statistics. You can go backwards even further, but in 2023, from a quantity perspective, there were fewer bills signed, vetoed, or signed with chapter amendments than there were in 2022. I don't know that anybody can make a confident prediction about what 2024 would look like, but that has been a downward trend in terms of new things becoming law, at least in the last couple of years. We shall see. Next slide. So there were a number of bills that were prioritized either by the legislature that were vetoed right at the turn of the year. The question would remain whether these become new initiatives and new priorities for the legislature. The first of them is the Grieving Families Act, which would have allowed recovery for emotional suffering in wrongful death cases. That was something where a number of entities, both business entities and insurance entities, were vociferously opposed to that, and it ended up being vetoed. There was a campaign finance reform bill, which would have increased the campaign fund matching in public funding of elections, which was vetoed. There was an interesting bill, I don't know if it was covered previously, about consenting to jurisdiction. So would have been a really fairly significant shift in the way that New York State treats out-of-state entities, that if you do business in New York, you're thereby consenting to jurisdiction of the courts in New York. That was vetoed. And then there was a ban on non-compete agreements, which went through several different iterations, none of which ended up becoming law. Once again, for those in the labor space, that's of, I think, significant interest as to whether the legislature ends up providing that concept or the governor. Next slide, please. So a few things that folks can look forward in 2024. There were some bills that were signed in terms of creating transparency around limited liability companies. The original bill had a very broad impact, meaning that the information would be available in a public database. This is something that then was substantially limited in the chapter amendment process, so it's only a database that's available to government agencies with a law enforcement purpose. There's a fair amount of advocacy around returning and trying to broaden that concept in 2024. And then there was some movement in the enhancing labor protections for freelance workers, which was signed subject to a chapter amendment. That chapter amendment will be passed into law early in the new year. And then there are some newly enacted limits on use of non-disclosure agreements and the settlement of discrimination claims, fairly narrow, but of some importance to some of our constituencies, particularly those in the labor concept, and we're happy to provide more information for those who are interested. Next slide, please. Also on the school side, there were a couple of enactments, one having to do with forcing schools to assist with access to voter registration for people who will shortly be of voting age. And the second was expanding what had always been the law for the public schools to make available menstrual hygiene products to students, and that expanding that to non-public schools. So those are a couple of things, certainly for those of us in the school law audience, that will be of interest. And this is really just the treetops, so we can certainly provide more as folks may find it useful. And the next slide, please. And then there's a couple of enactments in health, one having to do with protecting folks with HIV living in nursing homes, and another having to do with expanding the scope of health equity assessments to require consideration of reproductive health services and mental health care, which were not previously the topics of the health equity impact assessments, which just went into effect in August. All right, next slide, please. So looking forward, we're going to continue as a government regulatory affairs group, which Gabe and I are both members, to kind of monitor what's happening. We'll certainly be providing some information in the week to come as the governor's proposals become known. And so we are certainly ready and willing to help anybody who may have interests in what's going on in Albany that may impact their business operations. With that, I will turn it back to Gabe.
Roger, thank you. That was a succinct update in the few minutes that we had, but I'm hopeful that it gives everyone a flavor of what we see as the topics that will be animating at the legislative and other regulatory levels over the course of 24. We'll find out whether we've gotten it all right or wrong, as it were, over these next few days as the budget is released. And before that, the governor makes her address later this afternoon. But for those of us, and like Roger, I count myself among them, who's excited about this time of year and all that's possible. We'll be keeping tabs and making sure that we can be of help to all of you. Let me shift gears a bit. And Seth Gilbertson is our next speaker. Seth is with us from Buffalo. Seth is also a member of our government group, by the way. But Seth, most of the time, as it were, focuses his energies on higher education. As all of you know, he has a long and storied career that precedes Bond in the service of institutions of higher education, particularly in the state space. And he is here to look ahead, as he did last year around this time, to let us know what we can expect in higher education during 2024. Some of us were meeting in advance of this morning, and we realized there's way too much to roll up into 10 minutes or fewer that, Seth can meaningfully address now. So consider this part one of what we expect will be a set of updates over the course of these early weeks of 24. So Seth, with that, the floor is yours, and thank you for coming on back. Happy New Year.
Thanks, Gabe. Thanks, Roger. For that, I think your last slide there was a good segue here. Next slide, please. Because one of the things that I think we can expect over the next year in higher education, this is similar to a lot of sectors, I'm sure, a lot of areas, is political turbulence and uncertainty. It's a little different for us this year in higher education, at least the way I see it, than maybe it has been in past years. We're always used, particularly in election year, used to some issues that may be legislative or regulatory that are likely to affect us, things that we're watching closely, whether it be Title IV funding issues or affirmative action in the courts or Title IX at the regulatory sphere, things like that we've been watching over the last few years and that we're often going into a year watching and waiting for something to happen on. This year, it's almost existential in nature what we're seeing happen with the way that the higher education sector is treated in the political sphere. I think the sort of anti-elitist populism sort of waves or ferments on both sides of the political spectrum seem to agree that higher education needs to be taken down a peg. And there are very few things that they agree on, but it's very unlikely, in my estimation, that that's going to result in less regulation or more funding. More likely, it's going to be more regulation and less funding that we're going to see come out of the next year, both the state and federal level. Maybe it will be mild with some impacts, but I think just as a general rule, we're sort of having to battle against we being the higher education sector, battling against a tide of bad press and being seen as sort of an easy target to punch down at for some politicians. And of course, the anti-elitism part of it is it's a little bit ironic because, of course, most institutions of higher education are not elite. Are not, or at least, are not in the category of institutions that are the easy punching bags for politicians. But they're kind of caught in the crossfire, caught in the middle, and grouped together with those sort of big, powerful and wealthy institutions that need to be taken down a peg, and sort of the rest of the colleges and universities across the country get sort of caught up in that. So I'm gonna see that's gonna be sort of a through line through a lot of the other issues that I think we're gonna face, but I think there does need to be sort of a lot of thought and concerted effort put into pushing back against this view that every institution of higher education is some kind of wealthy elite institution that needs to be given less money and more heavily regulated. So that's one of the sort of the less certain things that we can see happening. One of the certain things that we're going to see is Title IX regulatory changes. We've been waiting for this, of course, for anybody who pays attention to it has been waiting for it for a long time now, really since the last election cycle. And then we saw regulatory changes proposed, and then we waited for the final regulations to be released last spring. That didn't happen. They were pushed back until the fall, and then that didn't happen. And now we're waiting for them to come out in this spring. And I think they actually will this time. It's almost impossible to see how the current administration could push these regulations back again. But I think the real question will now become because we're getting so close to another election, whether we are just seeing sort of the pendulum going back and forth, or whether we're going to find some kind of stasis point where we don't see major regulatory changes in the Title IX space every time there's an election, or every time there's a different different party in power, because that's really what we've seen over the last several cycles. And particularly with these regulations the new regulations likely to take effect so soon before an election, it will be very interesting to see what happens after the election with those regulations, particularly if there are changes at the federal level in regards to who controls the Department of Education and the legislative branches as well. We're going to continue to grapple with the effects of AI. I think lots of sectors have dealt with this one as well. I think it's another one of those areas where the higher education sector is particularly affected, because we not only have to deal with AI on the employment, copyright, cybersecurity, all of those areas, but also on the academic honesty, academic dishonesty, student affairs, student conduct, and research. As Roger mentioned, there's quite a lot of the AI research takes place on university campuses, and in fact, there's a major initiative now in New York that involves several university campuses to push forward with more AI research. So that's another area that we're likely to see a lot of continued changes to how we do things on both the academic and research and operational sides of things, and we'll be watching that very closely. Likely to see more regulation and potentially legislation as well. As we all, particularly in New York, we often see the city will enact some type of legislation, and the state will follow with some similar legislation later on. We've already seen AI employment related legislation in the city. I know it's been discussed on this webinar several times in the past. It wouldn't be at all shocking, I don't think, to see some sort of parallel legislation at the state level. Another thing that we've seen over the past year, and what we expect to continue seeing, is greater unionization efforts on campus, particularly in the student employee sector, adjuncts, research assistants, folks like that. That's certainly been encouraged and supported by the National Labor Relations Board. We expect to continue to see that across the sector, even in institutions that are already highly unionized are likely to become more so. Institutions that are not unionized are likely to see efforts at unionization on their campuses. That may coincide sort of with with downsizing at many institutions that we're going to see as a result of enrollment changes. There's been some of that already, but I think it's going to continue as institutions continue to grapple with the effects of declining enrollment and demographic changes Which brings me to my next point. It's likely that there are going to be more mergers. We saw mergers and closures of institutions last year. The small private sector, small private institutions have been particularly hard hit with enrollment and demographic changes over the last several years. And, that's a trend that appears to be continuing. It doesn't affect all aspects of the higher education sector the same. The large research institutions seem to be doing okay. Recently, community colleges have seen some gains. But again, those small private institutions have been sort of particularly adversely affected by enrollment and demographic changes. We see that likely to continue, which will lead to more mergers and closures. That's something that Bond particularly has been helping many of our institutional clients deal with. And it's an area that is not only going to affect those institutions that are merged or closed, but those that are involved in teach-out agreements, or maybe who step in to fill roles that the former institutions used to fill. Somebody still needs to train the teachers and the nurses and folks like that to enter the workforce. And if there are fewer institutions do it, then that's going to affect all those that remain. And then finally, big news last year in the higher education sector, even for those outside of it who are paying any attention at all to it, the Students for Fair Admissions affirmative action case in the Supreme Court, which struck down the use of race in admissions decisions. We're still sort of trying to figure out how that is actually going to work in real life. This is the first admissions cycle. We're still sort of in the middle of it. And students are figuring out how to apply, institutions are figuring out how to consider those applications. Beyond admissions, in the employment sphere, in the student aid sphere, scholarships, things like that, targeted programming for particular groups of students and even employees and other members of the campus community are all issues that we'll be watching closely, are all things that are sort of part of the fabric of institutions that are likely to be changing. And we're all kind of considering how the Students for Fair Admission cases and the many, many likely cases that are likely to come after that are many of which are already in courts right now being decided, and trying to figure out how the changes to affirmative action and similar issues are going to affect institutions. So as Gabe said, there may be more to come in terms of looking forward in higher education, but that's what I have for you today. Thank you.
Seth, thank you. Really appreciate your work to give a snapshot of what it is and that we can expect in 2024. There's a lot that we don't know, of course. As you said at the top of your slides, it is a turbulent time. It's a complicated time, and we'll continue to keep everybody updated as we learn more, and particularly as it pertains to your businesses, your practices, and all that is that as a group of listeners you care about. So with that, let me bring on our next speaker, who comes to us from Kansas, which is part of the Bond practice, focused in particular on collegiate sports. And you may not know Kyle from previous work, except if you have had an opportunity to engage in that collegiate sports space. But Kyle is someone who knows name, image, and likeness super well. He's one of the more experienced attorneys in the country in the space, and he also regularly advises on NCAA investigations. He's someone who, in the practice that we have based in Kansas, which really focuses on collegiate sports, is well positioned to tell us what within that space is up and coming for the 2024 year. For those of us who mix sports and athletics, as of course you do in your practice, we're coming off the heels of the men's football national championship game last evening. And so there's a lot of focus on college athletics in the news this morning. And so Kyle, let's hear what we can expect in the news for the coming months. Please go right ahead, and welcome to the show.
Sure. Thanks, Gabe. Well, Thanks everybody for your time this morning. I appreciate the opportunity to join. As Gabe mentioned, we have a collegiate sports practice group that's based out here in Kansas City. And the reason for that is the NCAA used to be right up the street from here when this practice was founded. So I've been with the practice about 20 years. All I do is NCAA related work, NCAA investigations, eligibility matters, et cetera. And as Gabe mentioned, a significant focus in the NCAA space of late has been on name, image, and likeness. The current events, I guess, and the year ahead. So because name, image, and likeness is a hot topic, collectives is probably a term that many of you have heard. I guess a little bit of background there. The NCAA began permitting student athletes to profit from their name, image, and likeness now almost 2.5 years ago in July of 21. And over a period of time, internally and available to the NCAA membership, the NCAA has continued to adapt its policy on NIL and disseminate that to the membership in somewhat of a quasi-legislative process, a series of interpretations and policy guidance and clarification. Now, 10 minutes is not near enough time to get down the rabbit hole of NIL and collectives and the current status of just how muddy those waters are on every campus. And it is entirely complicated. There's a lot of gray area, and many institutions are struggling with, how do we set up a collective? How close can we be to our collective? All that kind of information. The NCAA's national convention is actually this week, starts tomorrow in Phoenix. And that will begin the next legislative cycle for the adoption of additional rules and guidance concerning name, image, and likeness. And in addition to name, image, and likeness, all the other rules that NCAA member institutions are committed to abide by. This is a regular meeting every year of the NCAA membership. It used to be that the entire membership, representatives from the NCAA membership, the institutions, would get in a room and vote by paddle, yes or no, whether they would adopt certain legislative proposals. And some of the proposals this year do concern name, image, and likeness. So I think we can expect to get some additional legislative guidance and clarification from the NCAA here in the first couple of months of 2024. That's the standard NCAA legislative process. And in addition to the standard NCAA legislative process where rules are voted on and adopted, there are also infractions case precedent that govern how institutions should adopt or how they should adapt to the rules that the NCAA has, and how those cases should guide monitoring and compliance activity on campus. Over the first part of 2024, there are likely to be some enforcement and infractions decisions that are made public. Those cases are going to basically summarize, in some instances, several years worth of investigation of potential NCAA rules violations. And, in addition to your typical coaches' bad behavior and extra benefits to student athletes and things of that nature, there are going to be a handful of cases that concern name, image, and likeness for the first time, and how institutions or coaches or others around student athletes may have gotten sideways with the NIL policy and guidance concerning name, image, and likeness, for the purpose of actually committing an NCAA rules violation. So those cases will begin to churn out and further guide, how the rules apply to member institutions. There are maybe 24 to 30 active investigations at this point, at least that we're aware of by the enforcement staff. They tend to process all the way through to the Committee on Infractions. That's kind of the final judge in the NCAA world. The Committee on Infractions published 17 total cases last year. 11 of those are Division I, probably a similar pattern this year. And again, the guidance that's available through those cases on how the rules apply is very important to the membership, and in monitoring and educating coaches on campus and others on campus as to how the rules work. So, that's kind of the year ahead. We expect to get more of the same from the NCAA in terms of guidance that they provide through the traditional legislative cycle. Most of those, that guidance is provided to your faculty athletics reps, your compliance people over in athletics, your athletics directors, and they tend to trickle up to the general counsel on campus most of the time. And then at NACUA in the summer is when I think we all sit down and start to understand a little bit as to what the current trends and legislatively are within the NCAA. So that's it from my end.
Kyle, thank you. Really interesting to get a glimpse into your world and what it is that keeps you busy on behalf of bond clients, and what you shared dovetailed neatly with Seth's comments on higher education more generally. After that meeting in Phoenix, if there's anything exciting that comes out, whether there's a panel or not that goes in the air, let us all know, and we look forward to having you back. And in the meanwhile, thank you very much for coming on the program. And so with that, let me shift to our final set of speakers for the day, who are Delaney Knapp and Tom Clifford. Delaney and Tom are going to present together. Delaney's familiar to many of you on the program. She's been on numerous times previously. Delaney's based in our Albany office with a focus on exempt organizations. Tom Clifford is out of our Syracuse office. Just slightly newer to bond than Delaney, but Tom and Delaney work very closely together on exempt organizational matters. And together, they're here to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act relative to those exempt organizations. The Corporate Transparency Act, as Delaney will allude to in opening remarks, is at some level a major deal for organizations, but we're focusing on a narrow slice of it through their prepared remarks. And so Delaney, Tom, the floor is yours, and I'm hopeful that for all of you in the space of exempt organizational practice, that this is of particular value to you. Please go right ahead. Thank you so much, Delaney and Tom.
Thanks, Gabe. So really, I hope that our brief presentation is a sigh of relief for many of our exempt org and nonprofit clients. As Gabe stated, the Corporate Transparency Act just recently went into effect, and so we'll give you some context for that, but really focus on what are the exemptions and what are some important filing deadlines in this upcoming next year that you might need to be aware of. Next slide, Kathy.
All right, thanks, Delaney. The Corporate Transparency Act is a federal law that was enacted in 2021, but as Delaney just mentioned, actually took effect January 1 of this year. It was enacted to create transparency regarding entity ownership to help the U.S. government protect the financial system from being used for illicit activities. And what it does is it requires the vast majority of corporations, limited liability companies, and other qualifying entities to report information concerning their beneficial ownership to the U.S. Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And such reporting must be filed on an annual basis. There's an initial report, and then assuming that you are subject to the act, then you have to file annually. And it's also worth mentioning here that there are both civil and criminal penalties for noncompliance. So it's important to understand how, if at all, the act impacts your organization. Next slide.
So fortunately, because many tax-exempt organizations already publicly report an abundance of information to the Internal Revenue Service and other regulators in New York, that would be the Office of the Attorney General's Charities Bureau. Most exempt organizations will not have to comply with this reporting. This includes their affiliates, but there are a couple of exceptions that we'll highlight later in the presentation. Next slide, Kevin.
Yeah, so as Delaney indicated, all organizations that are described in Section 501C of the Internal Revenue Code and exempt from federal income tax are exempt from the CTA. Additionally, wholly owned subsidiaries whose ownership interests are entirely controlled or wholly owned by a tax exempt entity are also exempt from the CTA. Next slide.
This will also include political organizations, split interest trusts like charitable lead and remainder trusts, and also what the CTA has defined as inactive entities. And there's 5 factors to fall into this. It's probably going to be rare that this applies, but we'll highlight it just in case. So these entities need to have existed on or before January 1st, 2020. They cannot be actively engaged in any business. They're not owned by a foreign person. They have not sent or received more than $1,000 in the last 12 months, and they don't hold any type of assets. What this is probably going to look like is an older entity. Doesn't necessarily have to be exempt, but for this purpose, we'll talk about, a nonprofit that maybe operated, several years ago, spent down all its funds. The board really didn't know how to go about dissolution, kind of disbanded, and it still technically exists, but hasn't been doing anything. Like I said, that's going to be rare, but that's one example of what that might look like. Next slide, Kathy.
So it's important to note here that newly formed organizations and by newly formed, I mean organizations who are formed on or after January 1, 2024, they will have to comply with the CTA and file the required information within 90 days after formation. There's no exceptions for nonprofits who have tax exempt applications pending with the IRS. So because processing time for tax exempt applications is typically between 6 and 9 months, a newly formed nonprofit will be required to comply with the act within that 90-day period. Once the IRS exempt determination letter is received, the organization should then file an updated report within 30 days, which will indicate that it obtained tax exempt status and is now exempt from the CTA's reporting requirements going forward. Next slide.
So Tom mentioned what happened if you're newly formed in 2024, but I want to highlight if you are, quote, newly formed, but at the end of 2023 or anytime prior, you will have until January 1st, 2025 before you're required to comply with the CTA. So that's nice. There's a little bit of a buffer. These would be newly formed organizations in 2023, which have either not submitted a tax exempt application with the IRS yet, or which has an application currently pending with the IRS. So if your organization submits your application early in 2024 because of that 6 to 9 month pending period, you may get your letter before the end of the year, and therefore you wouldn't have to file by that January 1st, 2025 deadline because you'd have your exemption, you'd be all set. We just recommend that if you are filing, your 501c3 or other exemption application this year, just watch the calendar and make sure you get that letter before the end of the year. Also, for any nonprofits that have not and never intend to file for tax exemption, so for example, some housing development fund companies that we work with, you will need to comply with the CTA going forward. So you'll have to file an initial report and then annual reports going forward. Next slide.
Another important area to highlight here is that if an organization has its tax exempt status revoked by the IRS, whether because of a failure to file tax returns or some other reason, it will have 180 days from the date of revocation to comply with the act. And because it often takes longer than 180 days for an organization's tax exempt status to be reinstated following revocation, the organization will likely be required to comply with the act's reporting requirements. So we recommend promptly filing the required information after receiving IRS notice of exemption revocation. Next slide.
I was told my audio is cutting in and out, so I'll keep this one short. These would be organizations on the shelf So maybe an affiliate or a subsidiary within a larger network of nonprofits. Maybe they're no longer integral to the network. Maybe they're inactive or they're going under consideration for dissolution. We're just recommending that parent nonprofits, organizations at the top of those org charts in networks, do an inventory, see if there's any organizations that maybe have been dormant. We affectionately call them zombie organizations that either qualify as inactive or that you might need to file these reports for going forward. And that's it for us. We have an article that will be coming out soon with some more detailed information as well.
Delaney, Tom, thank you so much. Really appreciate the effort to bring this group up to speed. We'll be looking for that article with additional detail. And you're both, of course, welcome back on the program as we move deeper into 24. Kathy, if you would go to the next slide. Here, this slide provides the information on the best way to reach any of our speakers today. We're glad so many of you came back to join us in 2024. We're deeply grateful for your loyalty to the program, and it's very much our wish to bring you good and fresh information over the course of this year to come. Kristen Smith will be with you on Tuesday the 16th. I'll be back with you on the 23rd. In the meanwhile, wishing all of you a really terrific afternoon, and thank you so much for tuning in.